the moment police arrest a Basildon man who has been locked up for life after a brutal killing in a block of flats last year. Cody Nolan, 34, attacked Hassan Busangwa, 42.
5 days, 7 months, 23 years. Three numbers that defined what happened in a Basildon flat on May 4th, 2024, and everything that came after. 5 days. The time Cody Nolan believed he could disappear into Brighton's anonymity after leaving Hassan Busangwa bleeding in a hallway. 7 months. The time Hassan spent suspended between life and death, his brain devastated, while the law waited to see if the charge would be grievous harm or murder. 23 years, the minimum time Nolan will serve after a jury saw through his lies in less than 3 hours. This is the story of how a man with a history of drug supply thought fleeing 80 miles south would matter more than what the blood trail inside his neighbor's flat revealed, what the CCTV cameras documented, and what his own mouth admitted under oath. But before we see how the evidence destroyed his defense, we need to see what happened in that flat, and why a good neighbor never had a chance to tell his side. Riverview Center sits in Basildon like dozens of other residential blocks across Essex, unremarkable in the way most people's homes are unremarkable. Communal hallways with worn carpeting, doors that open onto small flats where people live ordinary lives in the best sense of the word. The kind of place where neighbors nod in passing, where someone might hold a door or help carry shopping up the stairs. The kind of place where violence isn't supposed to erupt on a Saturday afternoon in May. But it did. On May 4th, 2024, paramedics arrived at Riverview Center to find Hassan Busangwa, 42 years old, lying in the communal hallway with catastrophic head injuries. The scene inside the nearby flat told a story the victim could no longer speak. Blood trails marked the path of something brutal. Furniture had been displaced. The forensic evidence would later reveal what neighbors hadn't heard through the walls: a sustained attack involving kicking and stamping, the kind of violence that doesn't stop when someone falls. Hassan was still breathing, but barely. His brain had sustained damage that 7 months of hospital care could slow but never reverse. While doctors fought to keep him alive, Cody Nolan, his neighbor, a man with convictions for Class A drug supply, was nowhere to be found. He hadn't called 999, he hadn't waited for police, he had simply left. What followed was a case that would move through the English legal system in stages, each phase defined by those three numbers. The 5-day manhunt that traced Nolan's movements through CCTV networks from Basildon to Brighton. The 7-month limbo while Hassan's body tried to do what the law could not, deliver a final verdict on whether this was grievous bodily harm or murder. And finally, the 23-year minimum term handed down at Basildon Crown Court after a jury heard Nolan admit that his previous testimony had been a lie. This is not a story about resurrection. Hassan Busangwa is gone. This is a story about accountability, how the machinery of justice dismantled a defense built on distance, deception, and a phantom hammer that never existed. Hassan Busangwa was 42 years old when he died, but the people who knew him at Riverview Center will tell you he was the kind of neighbor most people hope for and few truly notice until they're gone. Quiet in the way that suggests contentment rather than isolation. Helpful in the unspoken acts of decency that hold communal living together, holding doors, offering a hand with heavy bags, acknowledging people in hallways with a nod that cost nothing and meant everything. He lived an ordinary life in the best sense of the word, the kind that doesn't generate headlines or drama, the kind that simply exists in the rhythms of work, home, and small kindnesses. He wasn't wealthy, he wasn't prominent, he was simply there, reliably, predictably, living the life he'd built in a modest Basildon flat. The details of his days weren't extraordinary, shopping at local shops, navigating the routines of Essex life, existing in the anonymous fabric of a residential block where most people mind their business and get on with things. But ordinary doesn't mean invisible, and Hassan's presence mattered to the people who shared those hallways with him. His absence would leave a gap that 7 months of hospital machinery and 23 years of imprisonment could never fill. Cody Nolan lived in the same building, walked the same hallways, breathed the same communal air, but the life he'd built looked nothing like Hassan's. Nolan's name already existed in the criminal justice system before May 4th, 2024, not as a minor offender, not as someone who'd made a single mistake, but as a man convicted of Class A drug supply and serious narcotics distribution. The kind of convictions that speak to deliberate choices, sustained criminal activity, and a willingness to profit from the destruction drugs leave in their wake across communities like Basildon. Where Hassan's life was defined by quiet decency, Nolan's was marked by the opposite. A history of dealing in cocaine and heroin, substances that don't care about ordinary lives or good neighbors. The law had already judged him once. The community had already absorbed his presence as something other than benign. And yet, proximity is not choice. They lived in the same building because housing in Essex is housing, and Riverview Center made no moral distinctions about who occupied which flat. Two men, same building, same hallways, same postcode, but the contrast between them wasn't subtle. One lived a life that harmed no one. The other had built a criminal record on substances that destroy families, fuel violence, and generate the exact kind of chaos that most people move to places like Basildon to escape. One asked nothing of his neighbors except basic decency. The other had already taken a calculated risk with other people's lives for profit. On May 4th, 2024, those two lives collided inside a flat at Riverview Center. Only one of them would walk away. The 999 call came in on a Saturday afternoon. Paramedics arrived at Riverview Center, expecting the usual range of medical emergencies that pull ambulances to residential blocks across Essex. A fall, a cardiac event, something treatable. What they found in the communal hallway was nothing usual. Hassan Basanga lay motionless, his head injury so severe that the first responders knew immediately this wasn't an accident. The human skull is designed to protect the brain, but catastrophic trauma has a language paramedics recognize instantly. The kind of damage that doesn't come from a stumble or a single blow. This was something else, something sustained, something brutal. Hassan was still breathing, but the injuries told a story his body could no longer speak. His brain had been subjected to forces that would keep him suspended between life and death for 7 months, machines doing the work his damaged tissue could not. The paramedics stabilized him as best they could and transported him to hospital, but the prognosis was already grim. The question wasn't whether he would recover, it was whether he would survive long enough for the law to decide what charge his attacker would face. Inside the nearby flat, forensic investigators found what Hassan's silent body confirmed. Blood trails marked the floor, not the single pool of an isolated strike, but the smeared, dragged evidence of movement, of a victim trying to escape or being moved after the violence began. Furniture had been displaced, shoved aside in the chaos of the attack. The scene spoke of struggle, of force applied not once but repeatedly, of someone who didn't stop when Hassan fell. The forensic pathologists would later describe the injuries in clinical terms: blunt force trauma consistent with kicking and stamping, the kind of violence that requires intent, that continues past the point of incapacitation, that transforms a human being into something the law calls a victim and the medical system calls catastrophic. Hassan's head had been subjected to repeated impacts, the sort that fracture bone and rupture brain tissue,
the sort that leave permanent damage even if the heart keeps beating. There were no signs of a weapon beyond the human body itself. No knife, no bat, no hammer, despite what would later be claimed. Just feet and force and a sustained attack that turned a neighbor into a dying man in the span of minutes. The flat was processed with the methodical care that serious crime scenes demand. Photographs documented every blood drop, every displaced object, every surface that might hold trace evidence. Samples were collected, measurements were taken. The investigators knew that whatever had happened here would eventually be presented to a jury, and juries need more than narrative. They need proof.
What the scene could not explain was why. Why Hassan, a man who harmed no one, ended up bleeding in a hallway. Why Cody Nolan, the neighbor with a criminal history, was nowhere to be found. And why no one had called for help until it was far too late. Cody Nolan did not call 999. He did not wait for police. He did not attempt to explain what had happened inside that flat or offer any account of why Hassan Basanga lay dying in the hallway. He simply left. The decision to flee is not neutral. In English law, flight from the scene of a crime carries evidential weight, not as proof of guilt in itself, but as behavior that juries are entitled to consider when weighing a defendant's state of mind. Innocent people sometimes run, but they rarely run 80 miles in a deliberate, sustained effort to disappear. Cody Nolan ran to Brighton. The manhunt began within hours. Essex police knew who they were looking for. Nolan's identity as Hassan's neighbor was established quickly, and his absence from the scene was conspicuous. What they didn't know was where he'd gone or how long it would take to find him. The answer would be 5 days, a span of time that allowed Nolan to believe distance might matter more than evidence. But distance in 2024 Britain is an illusion. The infrastructure of surveillance that covers transport networks, council estates, and city centers doesn't forget. CCTV cameras track movement with the indifference of machinery, capturing faces and clothing and routes without judgment or bias. Investigators began the methodical work of tracing Nolan's path from Basildon through transport hubs and eventually to Brighton, 80 miles south, far enough to feel like escape, close enough that the Metropolitan Police area's cameras never lost the thread. The footage told a story of purpose without panic. Nolan moved through stations and streets with the deliberate pace of someone who had a plan, not the frantic energy of someone fleeing in terror. He navigated transport connections, paid for travel, and arrived in Brighton as if the act of crossing county lines might sever the link between what he'd done and what would follow. He was wrong. The Kent and Essex Serious Crime Directorate coordinated with Sussex Police, sharing images and last known locations. The CCTV trail was methodical, each camera capturing another piece of Nolan's journey, each frame another data point in the case file. The technology that makes modern Britain one of the most surveilled nations on Earth doesn't distinguish between the innocent and the guilty. It simply records. The interpretation comes later in interview rooms and courtrooms. On the 5th day, Sussex Police located and arrested Cody Nolan in Brighton. He was returned to Essex by officers who had spent nearly a week tracking his movements through digital infrastructure Hassan Basanga would never use again. The flight was over, the evidence was preserved, and the question that would define the next phase of the case was already forming. If Nolan had nothing to hide, why did he run? The law doesn't require defendants to answer that question, but juries are permitted to wonder. And in the months that followed, wonder would turn to verdict. Cody Nolan was returned to Essex in handcuffs, escorted by officers from Sussex and Essex Police, who had spent 5 days tracking his movements through CCTV networks. The journey back reversed his flight, Brighton to Basildon, 80 miles north, returning him to the jurisdiction where Hassan Basanga still lay in hospital, his brain damaged beyond repair, his survival uncertain. The charge was grievous bodily harm with intent, Section 18 of the Offenses Against the Person Act, 1861. In English law, GBH represents serious violence, the kind that causes permanent injury, the kind that juries understand without needing medical degrees. Hassan was alive, but barely. The law could not charge murder while the victim still breathed, no matter how catastrophic the injuries or how grim the prognosis. So the Crown Prosecution Service proceeded with what the evidence supported, a charge reflecting the brutality of the attack and the intent behind it. Nolan was held on remand. The trial was scheduled for November 2024, 6 months after the incident. Hassan remained in critical condition throughout, suspended in the medical limbo between life and death while the legal system moved forward without him. He could not testify. He could not identify his attacker. He could not explain what had happened inside that flat. His silence was permanent, imposed by trauma that no amount of hospital care could reverse. The trial proceeded at Basildon Crown Court with the forensic efficiency that serious criminal cases demand. The prosecution presented the blood evidence, the displaced furniture, the medical testimony describing injuries consistent with sustained kicking and stamping. They presented the CCTV footage showing Nolan's flight to Brighton, the 5-day absence, the failure to call for help or report what had happened. The case was methodical, built on physical evidence and behavior that spoke louder than words. Nolan took the stand in his own defense. He provided testimony, a specific account of what had occurred inside the flat, an explanation meant to contextualize the violence, to transform it from unprovoked brutality into something else. The jury heard his version of events. They weighed it against the evidence, and in November 2024, they returned a guilty verdict. Section 18 GBH carries a maximum sentence of life imprisonment, but sentencing would wait. Hassan was still alive, and the legal process moved with the deliberate pace that English courts require. Nolan was convicted, but the case was not finished, because 5 weeks later, in December 2024, Hassan Basanga died. The testimony Nolan had given during the GBH trial, the specific account he'd offered under oath, the version of events he'd asked the jury to believe, would become critical in the months to follow.
Ahead. Because when he stood trial for murder in 2025, Cody Nolan would take the stand again and admit that what he'd said in November 2024 was a lie. Hassan Basanga died in December 2024, 7 months after paramedics found him bleeding in the hallway at Riverview Center. His body had fought with the stubbornness that keeps hearts beating even when brains can no longer direct the most basic functions of life. Machines had breathed for him. Medical staff had monitored the gradual shutdown of systems too damaged to repair. His family had watched a slow deterioration, the kind that offers no false hope, only the grinding certainty that the injuries inflicted on May 4th would eventually claim what the initial attack had left behind. The moment Hassan stopped breathing, the legal case transformed. In English law, murder requires a death. Until December 2024, Cody Nolan stood convicted of grievous bodily harm, serious, brutal, but not homicide. The instant Hassan's heart stopped, the charge became something else. Not because the violence changed, not because new evidence emerged, but because the law distinguishes between catastrophic injury and fatal injury, and Hassan's death crossed that threshold. The Crown Prosecution Service moved with procedural necessity.
The GBH conviction stood as a historical fact, but it was no longer the appropriate charge for what had occurred. Murder, the unlawful killing of another human being with intent or reckless indifference to life, now fit the facts. Nolan would face a new trial, a new jury, and the full weight of the most serious charge in English criminal law. For Hassan's family, December 2024 marked the end of 7 months spent in hospitals, watching a man who could no longer speak or recognize them, hoping against medical reality that some fragment of the person they knew might return. It didn't. What remained at the end was bureaucracy. Death certificates, funeral arrangements, and the notification from the Crown Prosecution Service that the case would proceed to a murder trial. They had already endured one trial. They had already heard the evidence, seen the crime scene photographs, listened to medical experts describe the sustained violence that destroyed Hassan's brain. The GBH conviction in November had offered a form of closure, a legal acknowledgement that what happened to Hassan was criminal, intentional, and deserving of punishment. But closure is not permanent when the victim is still dying. Now they would face it again. The same evidence, the same courtroom, the same defendant. But this time, the stakes were absolute. Murder carries a mandatory life sentence in English law. The only question for the judge would be the minimum term, how many years Nolan would serve before becoming eligible for parole. The jury's only question would be whether the prosecution could prove beyond reasonable doubt that Hassan's death resulted from Nolan's unlawful actions.
The family prepared for another round of testimony, another invasion of grief by the procedural demands of justice. Hassan was gone. The trial could not bring him back, but it could ensure that the law recognized his death for what it was. The murder trial opened at Basildon Crown Court, with the prosecution presenting a case built on physical evidence, medical testimony, and behavior that spoke to guilt. The blood trail inside the flat, the forensic analysis confirming sustained kicking and stamping, the catastrophic brain injuries that kept Hassan alive for 7 months before finally killing him, and the flight, 80 miles to Brighton, 5 days of deliberate absence, no call to emergency services, no attempt to explain or justify what had happened. The Crown's argument was methodical. Cody Nolan had inflicted fatal injuries on Hassan Basanga in a sustained and brutal attack, then fled to avoid arrest. The evidence was overwhelming. The medical experts were unequivocal. Hassan's death was the direct result of the violence inflicted on May 4, 2024. The prosecution rested with the confidence of a case where the facts spoke for themselves. Nolan's defense took a different approach. He admitted the attack occurred. He admitted causing the injuries, but he claimed self-defense. According to his testimony, Hassan had come at him with a hammer, a weapon that justified the use of deadly force, a threat that transformed the violence from murder into lawful protection of his own life. The hammer, Nolan insisted, explained everything. The prosecution had one question: where was the hammer? The forensic team had processed the flat with exhaustive care, every surface photographed, every item cataloged, every potential weapon documented. No hammer was found at the scene, not in the flat, not in the hallway, not anywhere within the vicinity of the attack. The defense offered no explanation for its absence beyond suggesting it had been removed or overlooked. The jury was left to weigh an invisible weapon against visible blood. Then came the moment that would define the trial. Under cross-examination, Nolan admitted that the testimony he had given during the November 2024 GBH trial,
The specific account he'd provided under oath, the version of events he'd asked a jury to believe, was a lie. He had perjured himself. He had lied in court, on the record, in a criminal trial where a man's life hung in the balance. The prosecution seized the admission with surgical precision. If you lied then, why should this jury believe you now? If your testimony in November was fabricated, why should your claim of self-defense be treated as truth? If you were willing to commit perjury once, what prevents you from doing it again? Nolan had no answer that could restore what his admission had destroyed. Credibility, once shattered, does not repair itself on the witness stand. The jury had been asked to believe in a
phantom hammer and trust the word of a man who confessed to lying under oath. The prosecution rested. The defense had nothing left. The prosecution's closing argument was surgical. They did not need to speculate about Cody Nolan's character or motives. They did not need to construct elaborate theories about what might have happened inside that flat. Nolan had already given them everything they needed when he admitted under oath that his previous testimony had been a lie. If you lied then, why should anyone believe you now? The question hung in the courtroom with the weight of something unanswerable. Nolan had stood before a jury in November 2024 and provided a specific account of the events of May 4th. He had sworn to tell the truth. The jury had convicted him of grievous bodily harm based on the evidence, not his testimony, but he had still chosen to lie under oath in a criminal trial. Now, months later, facing a murder charge, he had taken the stand again with a new story: self-defense against a hammer attack that left no physical evidence, no weapon, no corroboration beyond his own word. The prosecution dismantled the claim with methodical precision. The forensic team found no hammer at the scene. The blood evidence showed a sustained attack, not a brief struggle. The medical testimony described injuries consistent with prolonged kicking and stamping, not a single defensive act. And the Elon flight to Brighton, 80 miles, 5 days, no contact with police, spoke to consciousness of guilt, not the behavior of someone who had lawfully defended themselves. But the perjury was the fatal wound. Credibility is the currency of witness testimony, and Nolan had spent his own with the admission that he had lied in court. The defense could not recover from it. The jury had been asked to believe in an invisible hammer and trust the word of a confessed perjurer. The prosecution had physical evidence, medical experts, and the defendant's own admission of dishonesty. The judge provided the jury with their instructions on the law of murder, the burden of proof, and the standard of beyond reasonable doubt. They retired to deliberate at midday. The courtroom emptied into the waiting that defines criminal trials. Families in separate corners, lawyers reviewing notes. The machinery of justice paused while 12 strangers weighed a man's life against the evidence. The jury returned in less than 2.5 hours. The speed itself carried meaning. Juries that deliberate for days are wrestling with ambiguity, weighing conflicting evidence, struggling with reasonable doubt. Juries that return in hours have found clarity. The foreman stood. The clerk asked for the verdict. The answer came back, unanimous, guilty of murder.
Cody Nolan showed no visible reaction. Hassan Basanga's family wept quietly in the public gallery. The judge thanked the jury for their service and scheduled sentencing for the following week. The verdict was final. The only question remaining was how many years Nolan would serve before becoming eligible for parole. The law would answer that question soon enough. Murder in English law carries a mandatory life sentence. There is no discretion, no alternative, no judicial flexibility on that point. The only question before Judge Samantha Cohen at Basildon Crown Court was the minimum term, the number of years Cody Nolan would serve before becoming eligible to apply for parole. Not the number of years he would serve in total, but the threshold before release could even be considered. Judge Cohen reviewed the aggravating factors with the methodical care that sentencing demands. The physical suffering of the victim was foremost. Hassan Basanga had not died quickly. He had endured 7 months of catastrophic brain injury, suspended in a state between life and death, unable to speak or recover or understand what had been done to him. The violence inflicted on May 4th had condemned him to months of suffering before his body finally surrendered to injuries that were always going to be fatal. The flight to Brighton constituted the second aggravating factor. Nolan had not stayed at the scene. He had not called for help. He had not attempted to explain or justify his actions to authorities. Instead, he had fled 80 miles, evaded police for 5 days, and forced a manhunt that consumed investigative resources while Hassan fought for his life in hospital. Flight demonstrates consciousness of guilt, and Nolan's behavior in the hours after the attack spoke louder than any testimony he would later provide. The perjury was the third factor. Nolan had lied under oath during the GBH trial, fabricating a version of events he would later admit was false. He had compounded the harm done to Hassan's family by forcing them to endure testimony he knew to be dishonest, prolonging their suffering and undermining the integrity of the legal process. The admission of perjury during the murder trial had destroyed his credibility, but it also demonstrated a willingness to manipulate the truth when facing accountability. Judge Cohen pronounced the sentence, life imprisonment with a minimum term of 23 years. Nolan would serve at least 2 decades before the parole board could even consider whether he posed an acceptable risk for release. He was led from the dock without comment. The courtroom began to empty. Hassan Basanga's family left Basildon Crown Court with a legal resolution, but not restoration. Justice had been served in the only way the law permits, through conviction, sentencing, and the machinery of accountability. But justice is not resurrection. Hassan is gone. The flat at Riverview Center where he lived his quiet, decent life is occupied by someone else now. The hallways where neighbors once nodded in passing hold the memory of violence that disrupted ordinary lives in the worst possible way.
If stories like this matter to you, cases where the legal system dismantles lies and delivers accountability, subscribe to follow more deep dives into true crime across Britain. The numbers remain: 5 days, 7 months, 23 years. They tell the story of what happened, but they cannot undo it.